So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on accessibility and year-end deadlines. My name is Nick Reuter, and I'm a research advisor with AMO Enterprise Center and with LAS. As you all know, the December 31st, 2021 deadline is approaching for the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. And today, AMO's barrier-free website partner, eSolutions Group, will discuss what you need to do by December 31st and what assistance is available to you to help meet the deadline. By the end of this webinar, you will have a firm understanding of the AODA, including technical aspects of the Act, what needs to be completed by the December 31st compliance date, and how to develop an action plan to help you meet the deadline for compliance. Before I introduce our speakers, I just wanted to say that AMO understands that it can be difficult finding the right vendor to help you build an accessible website. So that's why we partnered with eSolutions Group back in the fall of 2019 to help support member compliance to meet or exceed AODA and WCAG 2.0 requirements. AMO was able to negotiate preferred member pricing for accessible website development with eSolutions Group, and you'll hear more about that offering later in this presentation. I'll also note too that AMO in the past has received resolutions about accessible website compliance, and we've been encouraging members to reach out to the Ministry of Seniors and Accessibility directly if you have any questions or concerns about meeting compliance. In a moment, we will include a link in the chat if you want to reach out and to contact the ministry directly. So we have three speakers joining us today from eSolutions Group and GHD. Derek Roldan is the marketing manager at eSolutions Group and has been helping bring products and brands to life throughout his career, working with both within the private and the public sector. Julia Dunham is technical project management and product development at GHD. She uses her background in systems design, project management, and municipal service delivery to manage eSolution Group's municipal website and current development and custom development projects. Mandy Malott is the accessibility lead at eSolutions Group and works closely with clients to assess and understand their accessibility needs in AODA compliance. She also uses her extensive understanding of accessibility legislation, standards, and best practices to inform client and internal decisions on accessibility. So in terms of the agenda for today's webinar, Derek will introduce eSolutions Group and GHD and speak a bit about the partnership with AMO. Julia will go into detail about the ODA, and Mandy will speak to web accessibility and developing an action plan to become accessible. And at the end, we'll wrap things up with Q&A with you. So with that, I'll hand it over to Derek to get things started. Derek, over to you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Nick. And Mandy, maybe if we can just skip along to the agenda slide. And Nick, thank you again so much for the welcome intro. We're so excited to be here to present on accessibility. I know we've run a few of these sessions over the past year, and we're really excited to share some new information. You know, there's the upcoming deadlines, really helping AMO members get accessible. As Nick also mentioned, we do have our website offering. So, you know, if you're looking at making some updates, there's preferred member pricing through AMO to help you build a whole new website. It's a great price where I'll drop in a link in the chat and we can schedule some time to chat about that more. But today we're really here to talk about accessibility, what it means for your municipality, and where you can get started in building an action plan. So before I hand it off to Mandy to talk about accessibility, I just wanted to mention a little bit about eSolutions Group. So we are part of GHD Digital, which operates under 4 practices. We have digital intelligence, digital experience, digital labs, and our practice, we were formerly known as DCE, we're now called products and platforms. And our practice really helps bring digital solutions and services to our clients by helping them foster and build a digital ecosystem. And of course, at the heart of all of our products is accessibility, which we'll be digging into today. So with that, I'll actually pass it over to Mandy, who will get things started off. Mandy?
Awesome, thanks, Derek. So I'm just going to touch briefly on what the AODA is. So the Ontario government upholds the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, which we call the AODA, which benefits all Ontarians by developing, implementing, and enforcing accessibility standards to achieve a no barriers environment. So in terms of web content, Public sector and nonprofit organizations with over 50 employees and designated public sector organizations must make their websites and web content accessible as of January 1st, 2021. That means that web content needs to comply to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG, at level 2.0 AA. And then Julia is going to talk about reporting requirements.
Thanks, Mandy. So I know that many of you have been working hard for a long time to make sure that your content and your presence is accessible in order to meet the January 21st, 2021 deadline. But deadlines are not done, because now that the initial phase of bringing accessibility into Ontario is complete, we're moving into the ongoing phase of what reporting looks like on an ongoing basis. So as part of this, every 2 years, public sector organizations are required to file an accessibility compliance report, and those are due at the end of the year. And there's good news about this report, and that is that the template is provided to you by the ministry, and it really is quite simple to complete, assuming that everything is in line. The report basically gives you 25 yes or no questions. Some of those are pertaining to whether or not a given question applies to you, and then some are just confirming that you have done a particular marker. And if you can say yes, then all is good. In some cases, you might have to say no. And in those cases, there's space to provide an explanation, to explain what's going on or what's happening or what you're working on or whatever circumstances surround that. Just a little bit of background on what the purpose is of these accessibility compliance reports. There really are two. The one, of course, is to provide a mechanism for the Ministry of Seniors and Accessibility to audit municipalities and other public sector organizations, just to make sure that they are compliant. And this is done through self-attestation. But there is another purpose of this as well, and that is to provide you with a tool to be able to self-evaluate, to understand where you're at and what you need to work on, so that rather than having to go back to the act yourself every single time, which is a little bit convoluted and hard to follow sometimes, you can simply go through this. And if you can confidently and honestly say yes to all of the questions in there, then you probably are heading in the right direction. As I mentioned previously, there are 25 key markers in the accessibility compliance report in the current version. And these markers really fall under 5 different areas. The first of those is the establishment and involvement of an accessibility advisory committee. So this does not apply to all public sector organizations. It does depend on your mandate, but in some cases, specifically municipalities, that's a committee that you've likely set up at this point in time, depending on whether you're an upper tier or a lower tier. So there's a few questions surrounding the committee, both whether or not you have one, and then also what that committee's involvement is and whether or not they're partaking in certain key decisions within the municipality. The second category of questions pertains to the availability of your accessibility policies, statement of commitment, and a multi-year accessibility plan. So these are 3 documents that most municipalities are required to have. Again, some don't apply to certain small public sector organizations, but for municipalities, all 3 of these should exist. And we'll be talking about those a little bit later in this presentation. The third category of questions pertains to the establishment of annual status reports related to your multi-year accessibility plan. So the multi-year accessibility plan is going to be the document that outlines where you are and where you want to go, and really looking at that towards a distant horizon. And then each year you're going to be producing an annual status report that provides a summary of what you've achieved this year, any changes you might be making to the plan going forward in order to make sure that you're still moving in the right direction, and what those targets are for the next year that are going to be moving from the horizon into the short term. The fourth category of questions is your organization's internal training procedures. Of course, it is important to train people when they come into your organization to make sure that they understand their duty to produce content accessibly. But the ministry also recognizes that training does need to be done on an ongoing basis, both from the perspective of refreshing training, but also because needs in software and platforms change over time. So these questions relate to what you have in place to make sure that people stay trained. And the last of the sections of questions here is really just the ensuring compliance with some of the key areas where accessibility tends to become the most important. in municipalities, and that is the employment standards, information and communication, transportation services, design of public spaces, and customer service standards. And we want to take a little bit of a step back now that we've given some idea of what we're looking at legislatively, so we can talk about what is web accessibility. So this is a question I always love to ask people when we're chatting about web accessibility, to see what comes to mind first. My experience has been that most content authors are at least familiar with the idea of web accessibility, but typically what comes to mind for them most often is people who are visually impaired and the needs for a website and other systems to be able to provide that content in words for people who cannot see the screen. And this, of course, is certainly part of accessibility. That is one of the key areas, and it's also one of the most difficult areas to achieve. So I'm always happy to hear that people are aware of that and understand the importance. But we do want to highlight here that web accessibility does span beyond that as well. There are people who have disabilities related to hearing. And for most web content, that's not a problem. But when you look at something like videos or audio recordings, that's where that becomes key. There are also people who have cognitive disabilities. So these are disabilities that often aren't noticed on the surface, but can become really important when it comes to how you present content and the kind of language that you're using in that content on the internet. There are a variety of persons with disabilities who have neurological conditions that, again, don't show in most cases, but with certain things like flickering content on the screen, it can certainly create barriers for individuals. Of course, there's people who have physical disabilities. Most physical disabilities don't surface themselves when it comes to web content, but some do, and those are the ones that relate to motor control. So an individual who has difficulty with fine motor control may not be able to click a really small button if they have to maneuver their mouse to a tiny little button on the screen and click it. So that can certainly become a barrier. And then we have speech and visual ones that we've already discussed here. And the last comment that I like to make as well when it comes to web accessibility is that it really is something that affects everybody. The principles that you look at in good web design certainly do assist people with these disabilities, but they assist everybody else as well. When you build, it's kind of like when you construct a building and you make sure your walkways are wide enough so that people who have physical disabilities can make it through, and you make sure that you have lifts so that people can move from floor to floor. But those features you're adding don't just assist people with disabilities. They really assist a whole range of people in a whole range of ways. So the benefit is pretty wide reaching. On to the next slide, and I'm going to hand it over to Mandy again.
So I'm just going to break down WCAG a bit. So it's broken down into 4 layers of guidance. So there are principles, guidelines, success criteria, and then underneath each success criteria, there are sufficient and advisory techniques. So the principles are perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust, and we use the acronym FOR to remember those. And then the guidelines all fall under one of those 4. So there could be something like 2.2 is enough time, provide users enough time to read and use content. And that falls under operable. And then each of those guidelines also have success criteria. So there are 61 in total, only 38 of them are required legislatively because there's different levels. There's level A, AA, and AAA. So some of those are AAA issues that we don't need to comply to according to the law, but they are also very useful to keep in mind. So an example of a success criteria would be headings and labels. I'm sure that lots of content creators are aware of the need for headings, so that's an important piece. And there are a lot of ways to meet these guidelines. So each success criteria, as I said, has sufficient and advisory techniques, and there can be dozens of web pages related to meeting a single success criteria. So some of these can work hand in hand together to meet a success criteria, but there's also different routes that can be taken. So it's not always black and white. There can be a lot of different options to achieve a same accessible result. Now I'm going to go into what makes up your website presence, essentially what needs to be accessible. So there are 4 main parts to this. And there's your CMS content, so your content management system content, what you can add in on your website yourself as a non-developer. So this is things like text and images and tables, anything that you can add in on a content page. And you also have documents. So these can be PDFs or PowerPoints or Word documents. There tends to be a lot of those on websites. So they definitely need reviewed and they need to be accessible. That's something that can cause a little bit of confusion sometimes with AODAs and WCAG, is whether documents need to be accessible, but they definitely do. And then there's also your website template. So this is the technical portions of your website. And in most cases for municipalities, these are created by your website vendor. Sometimes bigger municipalities will have their own website with their own development team. But regardless, this isn't something that most users can adjust or make changes to. It's always developers. And then lastly, there's other media and integrations. This is a bit of a catch-all category. You can have things like videos, audio recordings, and third-party widgets. So video and audio, as Julia said, they need captions and sometimes transcripts. So that's very relevant to accessibility. And then third-party widgets often need to be reviewed on a case-by-case basis, because this can cover a lot of different tools. It could be something really tiny integrated onto a web page, or it could be some sort of form that appears, a third-party tool, anything like that. And often that does require some technical review from someone quite experienced in web accessibility to review those. So I'm going to go into each of those categories. So when it comes to your CMS content, we say we use the acronym HALT, so headings, alt text, links, and tables, to remind us of what's most important here. So headings need to follow a nested structure, not skipping levels. So headings are essentially the way that it helps visually to see what's happening on a page, but it's also really important for screen reader users. As visual users, we are able to easily glance at a page and see the content, and we can kind of skim over it a little bit. But for screen reader users, they need everything read out. So if you don't have headings in there, it makes it really difficult to traverse the page because they can't understand the main topics of the page. That adds in some structure. Then there's alt text for images. So for example, you could have the alt text, young woman crossing a busy street. So that's important for images because that is the only information that a non-sighted user is going to have for images. They're not going to, since they can't see it, they have to rely on the alt text. So it's important for that to be descriptive if the image is presenting important information. When it comes to links, these need to be descriptive without the context of surrounding text. So the reason for that is that screen reader users are able to skip from link to link on a page without going through the full text around it. So if you have a few paragraphs in a row and they all end with the link text, click here or read more or something generic like that, the user won't have any context as to what they're supposed to be clicking on. So it's really important to have descriptive alt text, something like 2020 annual report, or you can even go further and say 2020 annual report PDF to describe kind of where it's going to take the user. And then when it comes to tables, simple is always best. Complex tables can get quite difficult to traverse, not just with a screen reader, but also for users with cognitive impairments or people with dyslexia. Complex tables can get quite difficult to understand. And it's also important to only use tables for tabular data, not for layout purposes. In older times on the internet, it was the norm to put a lot of your content in a table to get it to be presented the way that you want. Maybe you wanted to put 3 pictures and have them be side by side. So you'd paste them into a table. But that's problematic for screen reader users because they will be expecting tabular data and then there will be images there. And some other aspects to consider is keeping the reading level low, so preferably below a grade 6 level, so that it's easier for users with cognitive impairments. And not even just that, also if you have users whose second language is English, or second or third or fourth language is English, that can make things a lot easier. And it's also important to make content well structured and clear and avoid jargon words. So in this part, it's not just about accessibility practices as in HALT, but also just general good web writing practices. And then for documents, so this can be PDFs, Word, PowerPoint. There's also InDesign documents. Anything that's posted on the website needs to be accessible. So there are a lot of the same concepts that I just went over apply to these documents. So using HALT, so headings and alt text, you have to make sure there's appropriate color contrast if you're setting the color of your text, and if you're not going to just have it be plain black and white, then you have to pay attention to color contrast. You need to have tagged PDF documents with Adobe Acrobat, and I'll show that an example of that in the next slide. And you also have to set reading order, which I will also go over. So it's important to review for this whether your team has the proper accessibility tools and training. So it can take a bit of extra training on top of just knowing how to write accessible content in your CMS, to be able to write accessible content in various platforms like Word or PowerPoint or InDesign. And in terms of PDFs, we recommend Adobe Acrobat Pro because they have a lot of good tools, and they also have a built-in accessibility checker so that you can verify the accessibility of your documents. And this is really useful because you can kind of do it as you go. And then this is just a quick example of what I mean by tagged PDFs. So on the left, you can see this is the tags panel within Adobe Acrobat Pro. And you can see there's H1 key for paragraph tags, and there's a table there with table rows underneath. And each of those table rows would have table data cells or table headers in there. And then you can see on the right that the content is tagged. So this specifies to screen readers what the content is, so it knows how to read it out. So that's what we're talking about when we're discussing tagged PDFs.
So the next piece that we want to talk about when it comes to what makes your web presentation accessible is the website template that you are using on whatever platform you use to host your website. So whether or not you are on iCreate, if you're hosted here with eSolutions, or perhaps you're on a WordPress site or some other platform, whoever built your site is going to have what's called a template on top of that. And that template defines the look and feel that your site fits within. So that's what gives you the menu at the top, and that's what gives you the color scheme that you have. And there's a lot of accessibility concerns that are related to how that is structured and how it's architected, and also to the stylistic decisions that they've made as part of that. Now, unless you are someone who has built that template yourself, this is something that won't fall directly under your control. This is something that the author of that content and whoever maintains it will have to oversee any changes for you. And hopefully you selected a vendor who's produced that template for you in an accessible manner. And if so, then this stuff really won't be much of a concern. But I do want to just briefly go over what some of those considerations are, just so that you can keep in mind the sorts of things that can cause accessibility issues within the template itself. So the first of those that we want to discuss is the color contrast. So color contrast is referring to the difference between the light and the dark regions on the screen. And that, of course, is what lets us see text and images, is that difference in color and different in contrast. And so in order to make sure that text is readable, there are minimum contrast requirements based on the size of the text. The next thing is keyboard navigation. So any components that are interactable components, so these are things that do things on the page. That might be a link that goes somewhere. It might be an accordion that expands and closes. But all of these components need to be able to be navigated by the keyboard. So this means that on the keyboard, you might use arrow keys or you might use the tab key, but there's a mechanism to walk through the page and get from thing to thing to thing for individuals who are not using a mouse to navigate your website. So the website template has to be designed and constructed in such a way that the keyboard can be used to navigate that. And this comes into the next one as well, which is that it has to navigate it in a way that's logical. So when you're looking at the screen, you start at the top and you work your way down and you know where to look. And when you're going through on the keyboard, it should do the same thing. Since the website is made up of code, it may not have been coded top to bottom. And if a logical reading order hasn't been put in place, then tabbing through might jump all over the place and not go in order for the user who's on a reader. And so the template has to be designed in such a way that the right components come up in the right order. Consistent structure. So this is referring to specifically the menu, although there's a few other pieces that can fall into this as well that should be common across the whole site. So you can think of your site like a little city, and people get to know where things are and how to traverse it. And so the map of the city should stay the same no matter where you are. And if your site is built in such a way that you can take one path to get somewhere and then it's a dead end and you can't get back, that's going to be a problem for all users. And it's especially going to be a problem for users who are relying on the structure of that menu in order to navigate your website. Forms. Forms are used more and more as municipalities bring more content online. And there's a lot of little things in terms of how a form is constructed that can make it accessible or provide barriers for persons with disabilities. And one of the most common ones here is whether or not there's a label attached to the form field. And this is one of those examples too, where having a label makes the experience better for all users. So when you have a form and you have a text box that's blank and you're expecting the user to put in their name, of course, you need to have some sort of a way to let the user know that they should put their name in that field. And it's easy to just stick text beside the field, and maybe the technical team hasn't gone ahead and coded that in such a way to tell the computer that that field itself is looking for a name. And if that's the case, then there's going to be an accessibility issue here because the screen reader isn't going to know that that field is looking for a name. It just knows there's a blank thing you can type into here. When this is done per the standard though, and it is done with an associated label, not only will screen readers know to tell the user you need to type your first name in here, but it also allows for lots of other rich experiences like autocomplete. And that's exactly how your browser does it, is it looks at that data and it says, oh, this is for a name. I know what your name is. I'm going to put it in there for you. So other media and integrations. So this is that fourth block that Mandy was referring to on kind of the four main pillars that make up your web presence. And this is kind of our catch-all block. This is referring to everything that doesn't easily fit into your documents, your CMS content, or your template on your website. Because most municipalities, especially as people bring more and more things online, are using third-party tools to perhaps allow online registration for the Parks and Rec. Or maybe they have their planning and building permit data exposed through ArcGIS, or they have their bus schedules online through some sort of a platform. And all of those tools do need to be accessible, of course, because persons with disabilities need to use those services as well. And this is a bit tricky for us to comment on because it really does depend on the particular platform. Each of those different apps is almost like its own little world, and it could be built in an accessible manner or it could be built not in an accessible manner. You will have almost no ability to change the accessibility of these tools yourself. This is something that when you're selecting those vendors, you're going to need to make sure that accessibility is something that you consider when deciding which platform is the right platform to put on your website. One other note that we want to just bring up here, this is not having to do with what content you actually post, but what you're using to build the content that you're going to post. So very often we don't write content directly on our website. We write it in Word ahead of time, or we write it in emails, or we use one of many other tools, and we export that content and we then go ahead and put it onto our online system. And not all tools are created equally. So a tool like Microsoft Word is able to produce very accessible documents when used correctly. You do need to be trained to know how to use the heading order features and how to add alt tag into Word, but all of that can be done. And so as long as your authors are producing content the way it's meant to be produced in Word, then the results are usually quite good. That being said, if you choose to write your documents in Notepad on your computer, you don't have the ability to set heading order and you don't have the ability to set alt tags. So you're going to run into a problem at that point. One specific one I really would like to highlight here is InDesign. InDesign is a product by Adobe, and it's the software that's used to produce lots of magazines and graphical spreads. If you have a graphics design department, they almost certainly do use InDesign. And if you outsource your graphic design, then the company that you use to produce those documents is probably using InDesign as well. Now, InDesign, being made by Adobe, who's the company that makes Acrobat Pro, is actually able to produce extremely well-formed accessible documents, even for complex layouts like magazine spreads. But this is something that really has to be done as part of your original design for the document. If you have a vendor who's producing a magazine for you in InDesign and they export that as a PDF and they don't write it in a way that's accessible and they give it to you, it's going to be very, very difficult to go into Acrobat Pro and make those changes you need to make it accessible after the fact. But if you're working with designers, either internally or externally, who have training to know how to produce an accessible document, and they take that as a consideration when producing their content, then it is possible to make very accessible documents that still have that rich magazine-like layout. Another one that we wanted to mention was financial systems. So for many municipalities, you are posting content that comes out of your financial backend, whatever that backend might be. It might be GP, or it might be VADIM, or it might be SAP. And a lot of those reports are not going to be accessible by default. So if you want to have accessible documents on your website, which I hope you do, and if you want to produce those budget documents in a way that is accessible, then you're going to have to get a bit more creative. This could mean that rather than posting the documents that directly come out of GP, perhaps you take summaries of them and you bring those tables into Excel and you do what has to be done to make them accessible, and that's what you post. There's also some other third-party tools that can be utilized to take your budget and can provide it in a way that users can kind of navigate through it directly on the website in an attractive manner and also in an accessible manner. So there are choices here, but you have to remember, where did that content come from? And is that originating application going to give me something accessible or not? The third one we wanted to mention was reports that are coming from engineering firms or other places that are outside the municipality. Even though this is not a document that you yourself are producing, this is still documents that you're responsible for, because you're the one who is in control of that relationship. So if you select an engineering company that's going to do an EA for you, and that environmental assessment comes back and it's not accessible, that does become your problem. And once you've received that final document, it's going to be very difficult to fix it at that point. What you really will be in a better place to have done would be to make sure that the vendor that you're using produces it accessible from the ground up when they first build that document. So moving on to the next section of our presentation, we want to talk a little bit about an accessibility action plan and what that looks like. So on the next slide, we had a little bit of fun here, and we wanted to kind of create two categories that you might find yourself in. So the first of those categories is what we're calling the ship is sinking. And this is where you might find yourself if you don't really have any training in place right now, and you'd say your content is largely inaccessible, kind of across the board for your content, your PDFs, and your third-party tools. Don't worry, there's still hope. This is something that you can remediate, but there's a lot of work ahead. So we want to talk a little bit about what that's going to look like, if that's maybe how you would self-describe yourself. The second category we defined was the car needs a new paint job. So this is perhaps where you have some accessible content on your site and you have some training, but maybe it's not consistent. Not everybody's trained, and maybe there isn't really the rigor and the processes in place to make sure that everything is coming out the way that it needs to be. But you've also got a good head start at this point. And in our experience, this is where many municipalities find themselves. Accessibility isn't new, so people have a lot of content out there, and maybe they're even 70 or 80% of the way there, but they know that there's gaps and there's things that need to be looked at. So first, we're going to talk about the ship is sinking path forward. So if this is where you find yourself now, then the first question that we would suggest you ask yourself is, who's going to lead you through this process? Do you have somebody internally who understands accessibility enough to lead you through this? Or is this somebody who you're going to have to consult externally? You are going to want to have somebody who can kind of assess where you're at and look through to understand where are the biggest wins. If you're at a place that accessibility really hasn't been considered up to this date, then we're going to want to recommend that you have somebody who can go through, kind of audit your content, look across the board at all of the different pillars that we just mentioned to understand, do you need a new website? Do you need a new platform? Do you just need to go in and edit some of your documents, edit some of your content, and also help to put in some plans in place as far as what those steady state processes are going to be to make sure that once things are starting to go where they need to go, that they stay in the right direction. Now, on the other hand, you might find that you're in that second category where the car needs a new coat of paint. And if that's the case, then the first thing we'd suggest you do is also take a look at your content, but more from the perspective of what remains. If this is where you are now, then you probably find that most of your content is at least part of the way there, but maybe there's a few things that you're missing. Maybe that you're weak on the heading order, or perhaps you find that your third-party apps really haven't been considered in the past. So you're going to want to identify those areas, and then you're going to want to start focusing on what you can do to move into a steady state process where accessibility is always considered going forward. And I'm going to hand it over to Mandy now, who's going to talk a little bit about what those steady state processes might look like.
Awesome, thank you. So in terms of training, this is a really fundamental step in reaching compliance. And this is important whether you've already been working towards compliance or whether you're just starting. So of course, you need some initial training for all of your staff. And this will depend on your organization and how it's structured in terms of who needs the training and who needs which training. You also have to determine this for an onboarding process. So this will depend on each person's responsibility. So everyone should definitely have basic training. And I would say this includes some basic Word training, how to create documents that are accessible in Word, because a lot of people work in there, but you may not need to give some specific training to everyone. For example, you certainly don't need to train everyone in InDesign accessibility. You likely just need to teach your designers, and there may also just be certain things that you need to have training on for example, some really complex table remediation in Acrobat, maybe for people that are taking care of the financial statements. And it's also important to consider ongoing training. So it's great to give everyone training once and then keep giving people training when they're onboarding for new staff, but we also need to keep this up. So this may look like refresher courses or just some practice regularly, but it's important to check in and see the quality and standards that your staff are of what they're creating every so often, just to make sure everyone is up to date. And it's also super important to have a governance structure. So this applies to having a process for reviewing your content before it goes on the website. And this is certainly a really key part of it. But it's also important to decide how often you will review the content that's already on your website. So if you're reviewing the content before it goes on there, you shouldn't have much getting through and having much going public and being published. But it's still good to review. So you might want to set up a report every week, maybe every 2 weeks or every month. And this really depends on your organization and how often you're updating your content. If you have a website that stays pretty stagnant, you're only really updating your news or maybe your calendar events on a regular basis, and most of your content pages stay the same, you might not have to review as often. But if you are staying on top of your website and updating it really frequently, then more frequent reporting is definitely a good idea. And scanning software can be really useful for this. So things like Moncito or SiteImprove can help you in setting up reporting. So you could set it up so a certain number of people in your organization get a report sent to them at whatever frequency you'd like, to give a bit of a reminder to review. And then you also need to instill accountability. So assigning responsibility for various parts of the website. It's really easy for everyone to say, oh, no, that's not on me, that's on somebody else. But if you have a governance structure that specifies whose responsibility it is to stay on top of the accessibility of different parts of your website, then that can help in ongoing compliance. And finally, you have to keep accessibility front of mind so standards don't lapse. It's really easy to, skip that reporting cycle, and before you know it, it's 6 months and you haven't looked at your website content accessibility, but you really need to keep it front of mind and stay on top of it. It's also important to have policies. So these are internal policies that I'll be talking about here. Something like a website writing style guide can really help content writers and contributors that include, and this training can include, or sorry, this policy can include writing for the web and accessibility best practices. So this kind of touches back to my point earlier about having a good reading, a lower reading level, and well-structured content. It's not just about adding headings and alt text, it's also about having clear and concise content. So some writing for the web training, which we do offer, is really useful for that. And then in general, just an accessibility policy helps a lot. So determining, like I said earlier, how often you're running scans and how you're testing the content, and making sure you do that on a regular basis. And then back to Julia.
So we already mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, some of the documents that do need to be completed per the Act in order to make sure that you are meeting your requirements. And we're not going to discuss these at great length because the ministry has put together some really good resources, and we've included the links here. But do keep in mind that you do have to have a statement of compliance and accessibility policies in place, and these should be publicly available on your website. So the ministry has given really good templates here to get you started. If those templates really apply and resonate to your organization, you could use them verbatim, or of course you can change them and modify however you see fit in order to align with your own individual mandates. But this is something that you will have to complete as part of that compliance report. On to the next slide. We also wanted to talk a little bit about that multi-year action plan. So the main component of this plan, of course, is going to be the strategy that you're going to take in order to establish, implement, maintain, and promote accessibility. And right in the Act itself, it tells you that that strategy should be tailored to remove barriers and meet the regulatory requirements that apply to your organization. So what we've talked about here so far has mostly been the internal action plan that you're going to want to implement in order to get to that point. And a lot of those details that we've discussed aren't going to make it directly into that multi-year action plan because that's a public document. The purpose of that document really is to outline at a very high level where you are and where you need to go and where the biggest wins are for your community.
So we just wanted to end off and say that we are here to help. I love talking about accessibility all day long. That's my job. So I love meeting with clients and talking about how we can help. We can help with those internal action plans, really breaking down step by step what you need to do, and with training. We also offer remediation services, lots of things like that. We produce accessible websites in case you need a new one and you decide that that's something your organization needs to look into. So feel free to reach out if you have any questions at all that we don't get to in our Q&A section. And that's my email there if you want it. And then we can just go into the Q&A.
Great. Thanks, Mandy, Julia, and Derek for the presentation. I just asked our presenters if they could turn on their cameras for the Q&A component of the session so everybody can see our faces. There we go. Hello. All right. So quite a few have come in, and we'll make sure that we get to them all. But if there are other folks that have questions of our presenters, please use the Q&A button through Zoom. So the first question I think I can get to, will you be providing a copy of the PowerPoint to those on the webinar? The answer is yes. We'll make sure that all participants and registered folks get access to that presentation. This webinar is also being recorded, so you'll also get a link to that recording as well. So first question to Julia or to Mandy. On the topic of media and other integrations needing to be accessible, are there ways to incorporate fundamentally inaccessible content onto our web pages, such as municipal 511 for road closures, etc.?
I can take that one. So normally you can't integrate fundamentally inaccessible content onto your website in an accessible way. Normally for that, you would have to present it in another way. So maybe that would be taking that information from the road closures and posting it yourself. One of your team members could post it, for example, in the news section of your website, if that's a tool that you have. But normally there isn't a way of presenting inaccessible content in an accessible way without some sort of work or modification.
Thanks, Mandy. So the next question, I think this is again to you, Mandy. Are social media publications included in the accessibility compliance report, or does it mostly focus on the websites themselves?
I'll actually hand that one off to Julia.
Okay, thanks, Julia.
So the compliance report does ask you to list out all of your web addresses where you post content, and they do specifically list social media in that list as well. The act itself is a little bit, in my opinion, a little bit unclear on exactly to what extent social media platforms have to be compliant. However, you do at least have to report what you're using on that compliance report.
Thanks, Julia. I think the next question is also for you as well too. When using alt text, is it good practice to provide definition of the object being described, i.e. picture, graphic, icon, then alt text?
I can take that one. So I'm sorry, we're switching it up on you. So that's actually a really good question. So when it comes to images, you normally don't want to say image of and then the alt text. It's really redundant because screen readers are going to read out what the object is and then the text for it. So it'll read image and then it reads the alt text. So if it's just an image, you don't need to do that. However, sometimes the type of image is useful information. So it might be useful to say group photo of, council members or something like that. Or you might want to say graphic of, to kind of give that context as to what type of visual element it is. But you don't want to say just picture of a dog because that isn't required information.
So I'll just open this up to either Mandy or to Julia. The last time I read through the WCAG requirements, municipalities were exempted from having captions over their videos. Is that still the case? What other considerations apply to videos that we should be aware of?
Do you want me to take that one, Mandy? So captions are exempt on live videos, not for recorded videos. So the thinking behind this when the act was put in place was that the technology to produce captions on live videos that will automatically listen to what's being said and produce it were really bad. And the resources required to have someone dynamically producing content for live content is also very, very, very intense. So unless you're a very large organization like a major hockey team, then you probably don't have the resources to produce that sort of content. But that doesn't apply to pre-recorded videos. So unless you're looking at a live stream like for your council, for instance, anything that you're posting after the fact does have to have those captions, including that video for your council. If you have that live video and then afterwards you have that recording available, then that caption requirement is going to apply.
Thank you. How do we best determine if our content is accessible or not?
I'll take that one. So there are a lot of different ways of doing this, and it usually requires multiple different means of determining the accessibility of your content. So one of the first ways you can do that is with scanning software, something like MultiYear or SiteImprove. They can find quite a number of issues, and it's nice because this is kind of an automatic, though it takes some resources in terms of cost. It can scan your whole website and give you a bit of an idea of the accessibility of your content. However, it's also really important to have someone that's very well trained in accessibility reviewing the content. So that could, if you don't have someone internally, that might have to be a vendor. That could be something, that's something we at eSolutions do, is perform an audit of your content. And that doesn't always have to be a review of every single page. Often an audit will be a sample of pages. So we might take a number of pages from each vertical in your website, since you might have different content writers in different areas, and you can have someone review. But I think that a combination of someone trained in accessibility reviewing along with scanning software usually produces the best results.
Thanks. Next question. I recently heard about PDFQA compliant documents. How does this come into play for document accessibility? We currently use Word and Adobe checkers for accessibility, but PDFQA was news to me.
So PDFQA is the Universal Accessibility Standards for documents. And this is kind of globally recognized in terms for accessibility standards. And these were put in place because while there are some standards for PDFs that can be extrapolated from WCAG guidelines, WCAG doesn't speak specifically to PDFs. You could extrapolate that, headings and alt text, the same would apply in, PDFs or documents than it does for the rest of web content. But PDFQA breaks down a lot more specifics in terms of PDF accessibility. So there are a couple of things that it addresses that aren't strictly required by WCAG. However, at eSolutions, we do actually use PDFQA standards. So we use something called PAC3, which is a free online accessibility checker for documents that checks for PDFQA compliance. And it's a really good way of having that documentation that goes a bit above and beyond Adobe's kind of built-in accessibility checker, because it's always nice to have two different tools or more checking the accessibility of your documents, because Adobe isn't always going to find everything.
Thanks, Mandy. Next question. Wondered your thoughts on platforms that use AI tools, example, Accessibee, hope I got that right, or AudioEye that allow visitors to streamline their experience based on their needs.
Do you know anything about that, Julia?
I don't know either of those two myself. I know of a few other platforms that purport to take inaccessible content and dynamically make it accessible using various JavaScript plugins that sit on top of the website. I've never tried any myself that I was really impressed with at all. These platforms tend to be extremely slow because since they have to run on top of the website renders on the user's computer, then it has to pull down the plugin, then it has to run through it and change a bunch of things. And they can be very buggy and error prone because you're relying on that platform's ability to use AI to understand what's going on and to kind of re-render and change things appropriately. And any automated process like that might work in certain cases, but in my experience tends to fail quite catastrophically in other cases. That being said, I don't know these two particular platforms, so I can't speak as to whether or not they're effective with what they purport to do.
Thanks. Next question. What do you recommend for documents that are highly complex and are very difficult to make accessible? For example, a 300-page budget slideshow with complex charts, tables, etc., that are not available in advance for staff to convert into an accessible format.
So for this, how you tackle this is going to depend on whether these are documents that are already created, that you already have on your website that are inaccessible and you need to make accessible, or if you're talking about ones in the future. So when it comes to old, budget reports and things like that, sometimes our hands are a bit tied in terms of what can be done. And these are cases where it can be best to try to find a vendor that can help with the remediation since it is quite complex. But the best solution, especially going forward, is to not have that situation of documents that are inaccessible that can't be reviewed by staff until they're done. That process from the very beginning needs to be changed with accessibility in mind. The very best way to address accessibility on your website is to think of it and keep it in consideration from the very beginning. So whoever is creating those slides, those documents, should have accessibility training. And I know that, complex graphs and charts and things like that, very visual elements are hard to make accessible. So the best option for that would be to have the content that's shown in those tables also within the paragraph text around them, so that the charts and graphs and everything are complements to the paragraph text, but having that content within the paragraph text means that you don't need to try to go about making your charts, tagging them in Adobe, which usually is completely impossible. And in that way, it's well explained and you're not trying to go through after. And if you're not keeping accessibility in mind, especially for these really complex documents from the beginning, you're rarely going to be able to really make them accessible in the end.
Thanks, Mandy. I think we have time for a couple more questions. Are municipalities removing non-accessible documents from their website altogether in order to be in full compliance, or leave the non-accessible documents on the website with the note that the document will be available soon?
So we have seen both of these. That is, something you should talk to your legal counsel about, what route you want to go with. There can be some risk to leaving up inaccessible content with a note saying that it will be available soon. That's a risk some people have decided to take. So we don't want to counsel as to whether or not to do that. But we have seen municipalities and other organizations take both of those routes. Lots of people have just taken down all of their documents and started from scratch. But related to that, one thing that should be reviewed when you're considering what to do with your documents that I didn't touch on earlier in the presentation was that you should also be looking at what PDFs can be actually put into the content of your website. So sometimes there can be a lot of documents on your site that could be added into the HTML content, like what you add in your CMS. Instead of linking off, you might be able to add it in. So that can be a way to sort of fast track the process of getting that content that's currently inaccessible onto your site.
Thanks. Okay, I think we have time for just one more question. We have recordings of council meetings that can be over 4 hours long, and our meetings are bilingual. What would be the best practice to approach this, since the discussion during the recorded video flips back and forth between English and French?
Good question. I will look into that and we'll get back to you on that one.
And I think with that, seeing that it's 1:30, I think we'll begin to wrap things up. A lot of good questions from people from the floor. I'm sorry that we couldn't get to some of them. What I can commit to is that we will look at those questions that we didn't answer in the webinar, and I'll provide those to both to Mandy and to Julia for follow-up, and they can reach out to you directly. So if members are interested in the eSolution Group accessibility offerings and how it can help your municipality, please reach out to Derek, to Julia, or to Mandy, and we'll make sure that their information is included in the email that we send to you with the presentation and the recording. As you can see, they're very knowledgeable. They'll be happy to discuss how any of eSolutions Group services can be implemented in your municipality. And like I said, we'll make sure that we'll provide you with their contact information in that follow-up email. So that concludes the webinar. Again, thank you to our great presenters, and to all of you for joining us and listening in today. Have a great long weekend, and we'll be in touch very soon in the future with that email with the presentation and the webinar recording. So take care, everybody, and stay safe.
Thanks, everybody.